today we are going to talk about how to know what season you are in. People always talk about knowing the season you're in, but what does that mean? And is there some list we can reference? So that is what we'll talk about today. And I actually have a list. It's not the ultimate list, but I think it will help to demystify the process when it comes to trying to figure out what exact season am I in. And why is this important to know? Because your time, your energy, and your resources matter. You know, you're on a mission to maximize what God has given you to do, and you can't maximize what you don't know. We need to be able to walk in the power, the authority, and the dominion that we've been given, not constantly reacting to life, trying to catch up, or living in a state of feeling powerless. So when we aren't aware of our season, it opens the door for there to be confusion, disorder, chaos in our lives and within us. You know, God really, He wants your eyes to be open to what's happening around you. So that is what we're going to start talking about today. I'm going to go over 5 of the 10 seasons. And if you're interested in the other 5, just let me know in the comments and I'll do another video. But either way, you'll get the list of all 10 today. Okay, so here's the list. There's the receive restoration season. There's preparation. There's transformation and death. There's elevation promotion season. There's your sowing seed season. There's birthing multiplication, waiting rest, capacity building growth, transition, and then harvest and reaping season. All right, so let's first just be clear on what is a season. So a season is a period of time that comes with certain signs, circumstances, and expectations. For instance, spring season comes with increased light, longer days, more activity in nature, and there's this expectation for you to sow seeds, you spend more time outdoors, so on and so forth. Well, spiritual seasons are similar. There's always signs, circumstances, and expectations that are tied to the spiritual season that you are in. The difference with a spiritual season is that oftentimes the signs and circumstances don't always align with what you would expect to see. In fact, it can be the opposite of what you would expect to see. For example, have you ever noticed that in your season of elevation, you face a lot of challenges, attacks, misunderstandings, isolation, so on and so forth? There seems to be battles coming one after the other, so it doesn't look or feel like God is elevating you, but that maybe He's even forgotten you. So if you don't know how to look at the signs, you won't actually recognize that God is up to something. You know, if you're not taking the time to go deeper into understanding what a season of elevation looks like, you know, you won't see that there are biblical patterns that points to the many ways that death comes before life. Seeds have to fall to the ground. They have to die before they can spring forth. Jesus had to die on the cross before He could rise and for us to have eternal life, right? David had to face attacks from his boss before he was promoted to king, and the list goes on. So if we pay attention to the spiritual signs around us using wisdom and understanding, not only will you have clarity, but then you can begin to maximize the season you're in. So again, spiritual seasons can have signs that are opposite of the season you're in. Another difference between a natural and a spiritual season is that in natural seasons, they have preset time frames attached to them. Whereas spiritual seasons, they're not bound by time, but they are a reflection of purpose. So there is a plan that God has for your life that requires you to have to go through certain circumstances. You know, you need certain resources. You have to have a certain mindset. There are certain types of people that need to be around you. You have to have a heart for certain situations. And, you know, there's a molding process that you have to go through, which I mentioned in the last episode. And so that oftentimes will determine which season you are in. It's always going to be attached to purpose. Now, there are times when there are seasons that are going to be longer than the other. For instance, your season of harvest could be prolonged prolonged or delayed because of your lack of obedience during your sowing season. Your season of transformation, and I'm going to talk about these different types of seasons, but your season of transformation, it could be brief because you're willing to make the necessary changes pretty quickly, right? And so all of these are just some examples of the differences between natural and spiritual seasons. It's so important for you to recognize that you're always in a season. The question should be, which one? I also want to mention that it's important to note that there is no such thing as a season of grace and favor. Okay, you're always in a season of grace. There is nothing in or around your life that can exist independent of God's grace. So if you want to create a category of lifelong seasons, go for it. And grace would be at the top of that list, but it doesn't come and go. Can you increase in grace? Absolutely. But that is a different process. That's not something that we're going to talk about today. That's not necessarily tied to a season. So let's just be clear that yes, grace, that's a continuous factor in your life. Same with favor. That's another benefit that comes from God. It can come and go, or it can be continuous. Okay. So let's start to talk about the different types of seasons. But first, let me say two things. You can actually ignore the season you're in, but you can never override it. The process is set because God's plans and purposes for your life is set. You have the choice to ignore what God is doing in your life and make things happen in your own strength and timeline. It's definitely an option that many people prefer. In fact, it's often what a lot of Christians do. They'll accept Jesus into their life as their Savior, but not as Lord. It's not ideal to have to accept that you're not in charge, that your life is not your own, or that your goal isn't just to make the most out of this life, but that you actually have to fulfill a calling and purpose. It's much easier to say, I'm just going to do me and trust that God's just going to have my back and my approach to this life. I mean, who wouldn't want the option to just do whatever you want to do and know that the living personal God is just going to support and back everything that you say, right? So we don't have enough time in this episode to talk about how ridiculous that is on so many levels, not only because God would not be God if his choices were dictated by man's and if he wasn't in control, but also because the fact that we actually think that we know what's in our best interest without God's direction. All right, so but let's move on. Now, remember, seasons are a combination of signs, circumstances, and expectations. Meaning, just because you are sowing during a particular time, that doesn't mean you're in a sowing season. You may be in a capacity building season, and sowing is one of the spiritual principles that will allow your capacity to be increased. So don't just look at one thing that you're doing or that is happening around you and conclude that that is your season. You really have to be prayerful and use discernment and spiritual wisdom. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to talk about 5 of the 10 seasons, and the first that we'll talk about is the receive restoration season. Okay, now this season is similar to natural seasons of receiving. Think about when a child is born. All they can do is receive and be dependent for a period of time. We love because he first loved us, right? There are times where God wants you to just receive from him and the ones that he sends you and just embrace being fully dependent. This is definitely easier for children than adults. It's challenging because in this season, you're not able to produce much. Things aren't going to multiply in your life during this season. It kind of resembles your rest season, but it's a little bit different. You're expected to grow, to learn and increase in knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. You experience growing pains. You can feel disoriented because everything that you're receiving, it's new and maybe it's even completely different from what you're used to. And so this is one of those times where you really have to become comfortable with being able to sit down and receive. Now, the restoration season is actually its own season, but it can be combined with the receiving season. But the season of restoration is something you go into after you've been depleted and burnt out. It's one of those things where your heart, your mind, and your body is being healed. So you need to be able to sit for a period of time. A lot of times we want to just keep going even when we know we're burnt out, but there comes a time where you have to sit and allow God to strengthen you, where you need to not open your mouth to complain, but to receive sustenance from the ravens that He sends. This is a season of nourishment. This is hard for people who are high achievers, or maybe men, or those who are task oriented, because you struggle with not feeling productive. But if you rush out of this season, you are going to miss what you need to be sustained for the next season that you will be entering into. Okay, so the next one we'll talk about is the transformation/death season. Now, the transformation season for me personally is one of the hardest, but it's also one of the most rewarding. This season is full of opportunities for growth and transformation, which means problems. Keep in mind, you're always being transformed. For instance, every time God's word enters you, you are being transformed. Every time you have a new experience, there's transformation that's taking place. But there are times when God wants to change something about you, and for that to take place, it requires a certain set of circumstances to occur. So if your issue is patience, He'll allow you to face certain circumstances where you have to learn to be patient. If your issue is control, He'll allow you to be in situations where you have no control whatsoever. So a lot of times we fight back and we resist this transformation process because the flesh, let's just be honest, it wants to stay the same. The flesh wants to continue with what it's been used to. We really have to stop resisting because we're just prolonging this process. Now, I labeled it transformation death because for you to be transformed, often something needs to die. This is the part that hurts the most. So for instance, if you have an addiction to food, the process of dying to that addiction won't feel good. Dying to self or anything that your flesh wants, it will not feel good. Stop wanting to feel good, but instead want to be good. All right? Your transformation, it's necessary, and it's always going to be internal. It's going to be your mindset, your character, your spirit man, and it can feel overwhelming because all these things are happening back to back. But know that God is allowing these things to happen because He's right next to you, helping you through every step of the way. He trusts that you are going to make it through to the end, right? So He has to allow you to be uncomfortable as much as He may want to make it easier for you or remove that obstacle out of your way. As a good parent knows, a child needs to see that they can overcome obstacles because it makes them stronger. It helps them to be better able and equipped to handle other situations that can arise. Many people just prolong this season because we're unaware or being stubborn, or we just don't have the guidance on how to navigate this season. It's challenging because oftentimes the voice of failure is the loudest in this season. Comparison is common. Feelings of resentment, feelings of self-pity, anxiety. I really want to encourage you to recognize that God will never give you more than you can bear. And if you surrender and allow yourself to be transformed, you'll be able to move on, and you're not going to be affected in this area in the same way in the future. Now let's talk about the season of elevation and promotion. And as I mentioned before, generally in this season, when you are about to be promoted, when you're going to be elevated, that is when problems will come. Now what I'll say though about this particular season, it can look similar to the transformation season, but generally the challenges and the problems that you face are coming from the outside. So there are these weird or unexpected things that just start to happen around you. People close to you start acting out. Your colleagues start treating you differently. Your name is coming up in situations that you had nothing to do with. For some reason, God uses these things to promote you. Joseph was just being himself, doing his thing, and then all of a sudden his brothers just put him in a situation to be enslaved. And you know the story. It ultimately led to him being promoted and saving his whole family. I listened to an interview that Steve Harvey did, and he talked about how he prayed that his reach would extend globally. And shortly after, he had this incident occur at the Miss America pageant where he called the wrong name. And even though it was not his fault, he had to deal with a lot of problems because of that. But ultimately, it led to people around the world searching for and Googling his name, and that created opportunities for him internationally. It happens all the time. So when you pray for promotion and you see the opposite, know that you've prayed yourself into a season of problems. The key here is to trust God to defend and to vindicate you. Remain strong in your faith. Look to him for help. Do not allow bitterness to kick in. You're going to see family and friends disconnect from you and turn against you. Just thank God that he's allowing you to see who is for you before he takes you to that next level. Okay? All right, so next, let's look at the birthing and multiplication season. Now, your birthing season is a little more obvious than others. You generally know that there is something inside of you that has been growing and is ready to come out. The key here is to be in sync with your delivery date. You don't get 9 months to birth everything that God has given you to birth. Some things you get a week. Other things may take a year. You have to know what you're birthing and prayerfully determine the timeline. There are times where God will show you things in dreams to give you insight as to what you're about to birth or what's going to come in the future. But when you don't know what you're birthing, paying attention to things like, what are the ideas that keep coming to mind? What are the burdens that you feel that need a solution? What answers have been poured into you that someone else can benefit from? So those are just some key ways to begin to look at what is it that you're supposed to be birthing in your birthing season. Now, this is also a time where God may have given you a seed, a gift, an increase of resources, of grace, and he expects you to multiply what he has given you. God is all about multiplication. Many of us are walking around oblivious as to what has been released to us, and it's important for us to know what you have inside of you. And part of the process of knowing is reflecting on your other seasons, such as your preparation and receiving seasons. So as you reflect, it gives you greater insight as to what are some of the things that you received based on the experiences, based on what happened in those seasons. So keep in mind, you can receive a seed for something in one season, but not give birth until years later. So what is it that you've been always talking about doing, or it's just been weighing on you a lot, right? That is a seed that is growing within you. Now let's look at the waiting and rest season. Now this can be very hard for some. This is a season where you don't see much happening around you. You've received the word by faith. The seed has been planted and you've done your part, but nothing is producing the way that you expected. You are likely in your waiting season. It can often appear as if God is silent, maybe that he's left you for a period of time. Doubt begins to creep in, and naturally we start doing like Sarah and seeking ways to make things happen on our own. The key here is to hold on to the promise, to rest in what was said, and to continue to nurture the seed with truth. Speak to the seed. Be prayerful. Allow God to renew you in this season, to take you higher in him as you are mounted upon his wings to see a new perspective. People around you, they will move on. They will give up. They'll expect you to move on, but remain in faith. Know that you are in a waiting season because God is working on your behalf, and it is his timing that matters, not our own. So those are the 5 seasons that we're going to talk about today, but keep in mind that the order of your seasons can vary, but everyone starts off in a receiving season. Okay, so unfortunately for some, your receiving season may have been distorted if you weren't surrounded by people who knew how to care for you as a child, so you likely transition into your preparation season pretty quickly. There are probably some challenges that began to arise. I didn't really go into the preparation season, but I will mention that the very first preparation season that you go through as a child, it plays a significant role in your calling and purpose. There are certain types of people and situations that because you were forced to face it early on, you will later have the experience and capacity needed to navigate those experiences and situations instinctually. You know, the preparation season, it can be painful, but the fruit that you can now produce is going to be so sweet and so purposeful. Now, it's important to know which season you are in, but it's also helpful to know the season of those closest to you. If you are in a season of growth and capacity building, but your spouse or your child is in a season of waiting and rest, you don't want to project onto them what you believe they should be doing based on what God is doing in your life. And I can give you so many examples of how we can interfere with other people's seasons. In marriage, it's possible for a person to be in one season and your spouse in another, but you may be in the same season together as a couple, right? So for example, when Mary was pregnant with Jesus, she was in a birthing season. Joseph was in a preparation season, but both of them together were in a transition season. So it can vary, and it's important for couples to know that. It's fun when your individual seasons are aligned with your marital seasons because you're going to have a synergy that is powerful, but that may not always be the case, and that's okay. There's also synergy and power that comes from just being aware and honoring the season that that person is in. Again, these are 5 of the 10 most common seasons. There may be others, and I encourage you to reflect on which season you've been through and which ones you're in now. The better you become at recognizing the seasons you've already gone through, the more skillful you will be in recognizing future seasons when they arise. God doesn't want us to be ignorant of what He's doing in our lives or for us to miss something because we are fighting against His process. The more aware and surrendered you are to your season, the more effective you'll be, the greater the impact you'll have. There's a level of peace and fulfillment that you'll experience, and you'll definitely be more effective in helping those around you that God sends. Now, being in a season, I want you to know this, okay? Let me debunk a few things really quick. It doesn't mean you're powerless. It doesn't mean you go on autopilot. You actually have an active role to play in each season. There are tools that are useful in some seasons, but they're not necessary in the next. There's a posture you must take in every season. In some seasons, your hands will face upward for you to receive. Other seasons, your hands are lifted high as you surrender to His transformation process. Other seasons, your hands are on the plow as your capacity to produce increases. No matter what your posture is in each season, always have a posture of prayer. And be careful that you're not quick to judge another person's season and what they're going through. Instead, just pray that they will get the most out of the season they are in. The great thing about a season is that it will pass. That is good news when we're in a difficult season, but it's also wisdom when the season is good. Never allow yourself to go through an entire season without preparing for what's to come. There are always cycles to everything. Storms will come. New seasons will come. Prepare. The more proactive you are, the better you'll be able to weather the storm. I mentioned this in a previous episode, but imagine trading places in the boat with Jesus while He's taking care of the storm. You are resting and taking a nap. Why? Because you know that it's your season to rest. So that storm, it's not for you. It just so happens to be close by. That's the power of knowing what season you're in. Last question that often comes up is, can Satan delay my season? Now, I want to say yes, but honestly, the answer is no. Did Satan delay Job, or was Job in a season, and which season was he in? I would say Job was in a season of elevation. Why? Because what happened after everything around him was taken away? He was elevated and received double. He didn't ask for the promotion. Satan wasn't even going to target him. God said, have you considered my servant Job? Job was minding his business, being the faithful man of God that he always was, and then God saw an opportunity to give his servant more. There is nothing that Satan can do to you without God's permission. So when Satan is allowed to impact something in our lives that leads to delay, is he causing the delay, or is our lack of awareness of what's happening around us causing the delay? Because most of the attempts of Satan can be avoided, canceled, destroyed, and resisted. And the ones that can't be canceled and you have to endure it, generally it's tied to a season of elevation. So yes, okay, in some ways he's delaying you, but ultimately it's you that's allowing him to delay you. So if you want to blame Satan, okay, but is he really? Now, before I jump into the chain breaking time segment, I want to say a big thank you to all of you who have given feedback that you really enjoy this part. I included this because my heart is to see people set free, no longer held captive to unhealthy thinking, behaviors, and cultural patterns. I believe we have to be willing to challenge culture. We should define our culture, not the other way around. There's a culture amongst certain ethnic groups. There's a culture amongst men, amongst women, an American culture, a Christian culture. There's so many subcultures that we belong to. And so my prayer is that any unhealthy principle, way of thinking, or behavior that has made it into our culture, that we uproot it and replace it with something fruitful. And with that being said, all right, you know what time it is. This is the time where we get to discuss a phrase, pattern, or belief that has been a hindrance to many in the culture. And if we eradicate it, it would improve your life, family, and the community. It's chain breaking time. The behavior pattern for this week may hit home for women more so than men, but it is telling other people that they need to eat more to add some weight. Okay, I get it. In some cultures, weight is a sign of marriage or wealth or happiness, and in others it's a sign of laziness, lack of discipline, or self-control. But what would happen if we globally, as women, as people, if we decided to focus less on weight and more on health? What if health was more important than physical appearance? For some women, being thin reflects a lifestyle of exercise and healthy eating, but for others, it's a sign of an eating disorder. For some women, being heavier, it's a sign of their genetic makeup, but yet they're very healthy. But for others, it's a reflection of lack of self-control. There are times when there's so many other factors that affects weight, like unexpected health challenges, changes in hormones, high levels of stress. My point is, what you see tells you nothing about the person's health or their story. So to immediately see someone and begin to point out their weight, it's not healthy, helpful. In fact, it's pretty toxic. It creates self-esteem and body image issues. It gives the enemy fuel to attack that person's love for themselves. This is a behavior that has to stop. Now, there are some exceptions. When your friend tells you she wants to lose weight and you comment that you notice she's losing, well, that's just encouragement. And vice versa, maybe she wants to gain. That's fine. But ultimately, though, let's care about the person's well-being. The way she is packaged is between her, God, and the person that looks at her package every day. No matter what your weight is, you are beautiful, and if you're healthy, that is all that really matters. Let me close with a final word of encouragement. You got this. Until next time, shalom.